either what was used to be called the Mississippi Delta Blues Festival or the Sunflower Blues Festival. They've had various different names, but I will be spending a lot of time on Clarksdale. But my presentation will be more a backward looking at the time period that was very rich for the emergence of blues music as more of a commercially recognizable musical form, but also the famous recordings of Alan Lomax that brought attention to these incredible rural artists who were working their way up to more future national celebrity and fame in Chicago. What I also want to make sure is that can everybody see the PowerPoint presentation just fine, and they're not just seeing my uh, face; they're seeing the presentation. And if any of the strip of photographs is blocking the presentation image, then I encourage you to use that little blue single mark to help remove them from covering up of the PowerPoint slides. Also, although Roxanne has said that you, as a group, have tended to shown preference for asking questions after the presentation, if you do want to ask a question, that's fine. It won't, it won't disrupt my flow too much. To try to answer something if you're curious about information that's being displayed on the screen or want a little bit more development. And I will also freely admit that when I get excited, I start talking a lot faster. So if I'm talking too fast, let me know and I'll be happy to slow down. With that as my little setup, I think I'll go ahead and get started with our presentation. And my goal today is to give you a little bit of background about our showcase photographer, Marion Post Wolcott. Actually, she worked and was employed by the Farm Resettlement Administration, and they had an incredible photography unit that worked throughout much of the 1930s, documenting both the impact of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the hardships that came about through the economic collapse, particularly in rural America across the entire East Coast through to the West Coast. And there were also cases where photographs were taken in the upper Midwest or over in New England. But the South really was a rich, ripe territory for these photographs to be taken. And they were largely taken with the goal of documenting the tragedy and then also eventually recording how the aid and support of various New Deal programs brought about relief. The other piece that I also need to let you know is that the majority of the images that I'm going to show and talk to you about, particularly when we get talking and addressing the images that were taken from the interior of a juke joint, are specifically from one locale, and that's Clarksdale, Mississippi. And it's possible that the images were taken from the Dipsy Doodle, a very famous juke joint of the day. So let's go ahead and get started with my images. Marion Post Wolcott is a very perhaps underknown, under-recognized woman photographer from the FSA unit. She actually was employed only from 1938 to 1941. And at the time, she was single. She got hired at age 28, and she was a college-educated woman. She had even spent time in Europe, specifically in Vienna, where she was attending postgraduate classes, but she was there during the early 30s, and she personally saw firsthand the impact of Adolf Hitler and fascism and oppression against friends and neighbors who were Jewish. And she really, I think, started emerging with a tremendous sense of social consciousness through that experience. But she also was raised in an unconventional house where her father was a pretty affluent physician, but he practiced homeopathic medicine. And her mom was a stay-at-home mom, but where her dad was very conservative, her mom was very, very progressive and let's say anti-traditional. And she taught both of her daughters to be very liberal thinking and to be very much aware that other people do not have the kind of advantages or luxuries that they enjoy. So she was, again, a very socially conscious, socially aware person. And had she not gotten bit by the photo bug, it's very possible that she would have continued her desires to be a dancer. She apparently did take classes and had some exposure with Martha Graham during when she returned back to New York. So, in terms of her background, after returning to the United States and New York, probably around 1936, she had about 2 years where she did freelance photography work, primarily in a newspaper setting, but she did find that the kind of gender sexism of the day was really difficult to work around. There are some good biographical information available at the Library of Congress if you want. And then I found perhaps the most informative brief read was a biographical essay that was done by Melissa McEwen in her book, an anthology called Seeing America, Women Photographers Between the Wars. And one entire chapter was devoted to Marion Post. And that really was her name. She was not married until the very final months of her tenure at the FSA. And yet, because her husband was a high ranking member in the New Deal, he forced the FSA folks to go back and rename all of her photographs, which was a pretty large body of about 14,000 images. So she did retire after marrying. Her husband had 2 children, and from a previous marriage, he was a widower, and she just found that she couldn't be a good mother and a working professional photographer. So in 1941, she retired, and she pretty much so stayed out of the limelight until her images were rediscovered in the 1970s. And by that time, she was living in California, and she did get she became involved in some different museums and artist collectives, and she starts getting recognized. But I think that it wasn't until more and more of the Library of Congress's images from the Farm Settlement Administration became digitized and placed online that people started really saying, wow, this photographer is an amazing artist, despite the fact that she didn't have as long a career as, say, a Dorothea Lange or a Walker Evans or any of those kind of more noted celebrities. She was hired directly by Roy Stryker, who ran the FSA project in 1938. At the time, I just thought it would be interesting for you to know that the annual salary of a photographer at that time was $2,300. They were given $5 for field time, 4.5 cents for mileage and auto depreciation when they were driving around. So they were very lucky to have a job and a very consistent salary, but by no means were they well paid. However, all of the images created by the Farm Security Administration photographers are public property. You own this. So if you are intrigued by any of the images that you find or ever see that say FSA, you can write to the Library of Congress and get them to literally print you a photograph from the original negative of a Dorothea Lange or a Marion Post Wolcott. I think that that's just amazing. The democratization of art is just, exciting to me. FSA photographers were expected to use 3 different camera models while they were out in the field and working. The most common 3mm format cameras were the Leica and the Contax, and that's Contax. And then for the larger or medium size film, the instrument of choice was the Speed Graphic, which produced a 3¼ by 4¼ negative. Now that's what we'll see in the work of the Juke Joint interior, her use of that particular film. The other thing to know is that the government provided all of the photographers with their film, flash bulbs, and various equipment that they may have needed, but the negatives were expected to be sent back to DC office to be recorded and put in the master file, and photographers were expected to provide captions for each of their images. So there was a lot of work, and not all photographers did a great job in providing captions. And artists like Dorothea Lange had a real difficult time accepting the public ownership aspect of their job. So there was a lot of kind of let's say, controversy over that. The Marion Post was probably the single most successful FSA photographer to document and record the Black American experience. And she really did strive to capture those unguarded moments when Blacks were taking their breaks, off work, leisure activities. And so she really captures some very authentic moments. And bear in mind that the time that she was doing this, particularly when she was in the South, was a time period of Jim Crow segregation. And the paradox for being a white woman, a single woman, and taking photographs of Black males, oftentimes in isolated rural settings, was amazing and profound, and really shows an example of someone really stretching the boundaries. And there were recorded letters and phone conversations where at times this was an issue, and that some people felt very uncomfortable with the kind of gypsy-like attire that apparently Marion Post preferred to wear, a bandana and a loose-fitting skirt, and just wearing bright silver on her wrist and whatnot. So a lot of people were really put off by that and felt it was very inappropriate for her to be present, whether she was in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina or in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. And then as we get into the deeper South, the cotton plantations and the cotton workers. So it was a kind of interesting mix here, and I do think she is someone that is worthy of a lot more study and attention. I'm going to move on now to our first kind of phase of our topic today, which is trying to address the idea or notion of vernacular architecture. And by that, what I'm trying to get folks to think about or consider is the idea of the structure of the buildings, the material, the layout, and perhaps sometimes the location of these buildings. Many of them were serving double duty. They were general stores, and in the evening hours serving as a juke joint. They also sometimes show very impromptu materials that look more like recycling of found objects and materials, or they are looking like that they're really, how can I put it?
No.
hang on, I'm thinking of the right word. I have this happen sometimes. Uh, Looking a little shabby by middle class tastes and standards. So what we're seeing is certainly making do and repurposing of buildings, pre-existing buildings that may have been abandoned, or buildings that just are going to show the limited amount of funds that could be invested in upkeep or maintenance, and certainly that show a range of building styles. Let's see here. This photograph is from Belgrade, Florida in 1941, and it's one of the final months, my final years when Post was working for the FSA. But I found this image whimsical because of its use of her name, and that is how she spells her first name, and associating it with this juke joint. So I think that this photograph has a little bit of tongue-in-cheek character to it on many, many levels. Now, this is one of the black and white photos that she took of the vernacular architecture of the outside of the juke joints. But my next two images probably do a better job of showing you some of the camera work and concerns that she had when she was outside taking exterior shots of juke joints. Now, this particular location shows perhaps a slightly better clapboard wooden build structure that's got, you know, an upper deck that appears to be windows and a door that allows access to that upper deck. But if you notice from the overhang of the roof and the underside of the deck, there are many wooden pieces, strips that are missing, that are exposing the cross beams. And so this building, for as much as it looks pretty nice, when looking at the clapboard on the side of the building, belies the degrade or some of the deterioration that's happening under the roof and under the decking. The other piece that is also being shown in this is the popularity of the porch to many of the buildings that will serve and function as juke joints at night. And so this is the Dreamboat Inn. That makes this a little more upscale juke joint. And it also, because of the signage incorporating the name of the inn, and also the incorporation, even though it's like a two-layered sign, if you look at the Coca-Cola logo, but it's a single layer of incorporating the name of the building, Dreamboat, with the Royal Crown Cola signage. And if you look along the area directly below the deck and above the heads of the gathered men, you'll see that there's just all of this signage about drinks and cost and names. And these would have all been soda, by and large, soda drinks, and they are, again, advertisement. And think of the irony, if you will, about the Great Depression. And here you've got photography that's documenting all the efforts to promote consumerism. And even though this is black and white and the colors are very muted in this image, that's going to be present in a lot of the exterior vernacular architecture that we're going to be looking at. Layers and layers of tin signs and perhaps, you know, other kinds of metals, but signs that are covering the exterior of the building. This is a pretty nice facility because it does show that it has windows and to access it, but it also shows the classic two doors to enter the building. And one would easily imagine, even though there is no specific white and colored only signage overhead, everyone pretty much so knows that the entrance for whites is separate from the entrance from blacks, particularly the locals. Now, this particular photograph was taken by Post, but she did not title this particular image. She didn't choose it as one of her future images to showcase her work. And I would argue that by leaving it untitled, the reason that might have shaped that is because if you look at the gathering of the men, even though the composition might have been fine for showing the building and some of the structure, several of the men gathered are very aware of the presence of the photographer. They're staring at the photographer, whether it's the man sitting in the second, the entranceway closest to her, the man leaning back on the chair, the man standing with his straw hat kind of pushed back, and then even the guy who's furthest away sitting back. All eyes are directly trained on the photographer. And from what I've seen while collecting images for this presentation, she does not like to use or select photographs for potential publication if they included that. So this became the selected image that she used, and more likely than not, she took this image and the previous image with a Rolleiflex. These are 2¼ by 2¼ inch negatives or film. And in the second one, she did title it as Port Gibson. And so now we have a location. This is from August of 1939 when these images were taken. And here we see that she's stepped up and she's framing the image more closely around the gathered group of men. Most of them, except for one, have relaxed and are a little bit more comfortable with her presence. Perhaps the guy sitting in the window might be kind of still staring at her a little bit underneath the brim of his hat, but by and large, she's become more innocuous. And so with this particular image, we get much more of a sense of the relaxed kind of leisure activities that guys after work or men that were working as migrant laborers or day workers in the fields are having after hours. You see some of the more drinks and things that are being advertised and tonics, but you also get to see a little bit more of the deterioration and let's say on that clapboard and the effect of rain coming through that upper deck area. So in terms of looking at the image for this one, I'm really just trying to showcase what the buildings are looking like, the maintenance and upkeep of the buildings, and to show some of the features of the buildings, like a nice porch. And this is because certainly at night, if the dance was really and was hopping and everybody was, having good fun, it wasn't unusual for people to spill out of the entranceway and stand on the porch or the immediate walkway area and have experience the cool breeze of the evening air while to stay outside for a few moments before they went back to enjoy the hot music and hot dancing. The other thing that Marion Post Wolcott did was to participate and experience, or rather experiment with Kodachrome color film. And this was a really new medium, and Kodak was providing the FSA with rolls of film to encourage photographers to experiment with this new color format of film. And certainly Roy Stryker, the director of the FSA, hoped that maybe by having color images to sell, or not sell, but to promote to the magazines and publishers of the day that more images of his photographer's work might appear in publications, in magazines that were being distributed to the general public. This particular, I've got about 4 color images, and this one is just to try, my goal with these color images is to try to showcase the variety of building materials, but also to talk about the paradox that, yes, we tend not to think of the Great Depression in color. We tend to think of it in black and white. And certainly in the 1930s, documentary became a mainstay medium, both in terms of film and still photography. And so we generally, in terms of our historical memory, our memory of images, even if they're secondhand from our parents or grandparents, we still have a very kind of black and white understanding of the 1930s and the Great Depression. But these images are just very, very profound, and they just make all the advertising imagery pop, quite literally, off the negative. And they also show that paradox and contradiction. Here's a juke joint where working class folks are going to go in a segregated society. They're being underpaid for, 12, 14, 18 hours of work. And yet the buildings where they're going to go and relax and hang out and listen to good blues music are primarily working to also sell. Again, most likely soda drinks, but inside, more often than not, the owner or the manager of the juke joint was also selling some beer. Excuse me, stout beer. That's the Jack's product we'll see in a minute. And yeah, there was some bringing in of your own private hooch if you needed it, because remember that for many of the juke joints, they had existed from the 1920s when prohibition was in play, I should say. This is a more widely known image of that is oftentimes shown today, even to talk about juke joints. And this image is from Melrose, Louisiana. And this is showing you, again, it's a rare example of an actual juke joint having a name. And many juke joints were rarely labeled as, Little Monkey's Juke Joint or JJ's Juke Joint or the Dipsy Doodle Juke Joint. They really did not try to draw true attention to the juke joint or the Black communal relaxation gathering place aspect of it. So that was kind of underplayed. That was on the down low, if you will. And with this image, we do see this is Frenchie's Bar, but this is also, and over here, Frenchie's Beer Garden, but this is also a grocery store and a fueling station, a gas station. You can notice again how classic and ancient that style of fueling system that's being used there. But again, notice all the beautiful, bright, vibrant advertising images against a kind of rundown building, and a building that is trying to become very anonymous with the setting, the environment, and the locale, for the idea of having the more private time, Black private community time that the juke joint offered in the 1930s. But here again, this is a clapboard building. Unlike the previous image, it's less on inside a town. This is more on a dirt road, perhaps going into a town area or near a farm or plantation. This image, I think, shows a stark example of the type of materials that sometimes could be used very strategically to provide for the setting of a juke joint. And this is probably, from other black and white photographs that I've seen, was probably a car garage in terms of auto repair services. But the pines is, as it would have been known to some, certainly is also trying to push Crown Royal, Knee High, and sorry, not Crown Royal, Royal Crown. Very different drink there. Atlantic beer and ale. So we're seeing here, though, the use of this corrugated tin, and when I did some further reading, they actually described this as corrugated iron. So I'm not fully certain, but some of this is really rusted. They pieced together patches, so it doesn't have a very sophisticated look other than being like a big box opening that would have had a little bit more height than what we saw in some of the other structures that seem to be much more lower level single story buildings. But here we see two kids hanging out in front of the main door. The materials, the location, and the setting of this juke joint would make me think that this is much more in an isolated rural setting that would have been, by all accounts, much more hidden from the white community and lesser known. From some of the readings that I've read, certainly about locations like this, a lot of people found out about juke joints in the 1930s by word of mouth. You had to know the right person to ask and ask the right question. And again, this is assuming that you're African American and you want to find out, you're visiting, you're in town, or you just got hired. Where do you go? And then through those kind of maze of questions, you would find out the secret location of a juke joint. And this would be certainly in lots of rural areas of Mississippi, but also important. Remember that this is not too off the norm of Black culture, because during the slave era, the secret religious meetings were held at night in the woods. So they were outside the gaze of the white master. And that kind of idea of anonymity is still very important in the 1930s because of Jim Crow and because of, yes, the racial violence that was still dominant throughout this time period. Now this particular image, this is one of the, I think this is one of the last color images I'm going to show you. This one was taken during the final phases of Marion Post Wolcott's tenure with the FSA. This one was taken in February of 1941. And I want you to be aware that these are all African American men who are sitting, standing, relaxing. And yet I think it's interesting that this is the one that she chose. She had about 3 other images of the this particular juke joint in Belle Glade, Florida, but she didn't select the others for as much publication, in part because the man wearing the kind of khaki shirt and pants is, yes, holding a rifle. In another image, he's turned around and the rifle is more overt and obvious. And I will argue to my core that it would not have been a very popular image to see an armed Black man, even if it was that they were on just using the rifle for shooting squirrels and hunting, that kind of thing. There is a sign that is clipped off over to the side that shows ale, beer, stout, and then part of the word friendship has been clipped off. But what this particular building shows is certainly a better built structure by some accounts, and yes, the persistent signage, but it also shows that this is a building that was built on a actual plantation or land that was owned by a white farmer, and this structure and the building beside it, which is serving as housing quarters for the migratory farmhands and others that we can't see, were actually shows an example of a juke joint that was owned by a white. And that was not necessarily that unusual, because owning a juke joint enabled the white farmer to get back through the purchase of drinks and, yes, the gambling and or other kinds of financial transactions that could happen in a juke joint, could get their money back. So they would pay them, and then they would have an opportunity to get those low wages back as a consequence of paying for leisure activities. Now, these images that I have, please bear in mind, this is all pre-World War II, Pearl Harbor, several months into the future. As I told you, there are some black and white images. There are also an alternate views of this in addition to other Kodachrome slides. But this image is one of the rare examples where the man who is very relaxed and's got his leg up and the other draping down, he clearly is looking at the photographer, but she at least found this image acceptable and was willing to go ahead and use it as her image that she sent in to Roy Stryker. Roxanne, am I doing okay on my time? Okay, I'm going to hope so and go on to the next. Now, with the final second half of the slide presentation, I wanted to move into the interior of the juke joint and move into the setting where the real life and warmth and community were experienced for African Americans, yes, who were living in a very, very hostile environment. And so I thought it was important for us to recognize that juke joints did serve for a number of decades as a safe haven for Blacks, where they could relax, let down their guard, have time to socialize and visit with friends, and yes, enjoy a drink. If there was an artist touring the town, they could perform and dance to the blues musician and his or her band, or oftentimes in many places they had a juke, what do you call it? A jukebox. And in Clarksdale, which is about, I want to say it's probably about 90 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee. I kind of think that's about a right thing. I tried to get a map in here and I just ran out of time, but it is not directly on the Mississippi River. It's on the Sunshine River. And it also is important historically within the history of blues music, because Clarksdale is a place, location that Muddy Waters regularly played and performed in during the late 30s. And that was certainly a couple of years, and then certainly later in the 40s he played there. But Muddy Waters was so-called discovered and put on the map by some accounts by the recording that Alan Lomax made of him at the Stovall Plantation, which is near Clarksdale. It's not that far away. And those recordings that Lomax made were in 1941-42. So you have to appreciate the fact that blues music up until this time was primarily music that people knew and understood by the women artists like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and a host of others. And that was music that was recorded and sold as race records during the 1920s. And not everybody was an enthusiastic supporter of blues music. A lot of people did see it as the devil's music. And even in the South, there were African Americans who were sturdy, strong spirited church people who would strong prefer a spiritual or a gospel than to sit down and listen to a blues song. Blues music by male performers did tend to be guitar based, and they were often unaccompanied, at least in the early years. And in the 1920s and 30s, as more blues male artists became the mainstay, a lot of their songs were about traveling and certainly being cheated on by a lover, and as such, they were troubled, and there was again a blue note to the song as well as to the performance, and that music aspect of the male performer, as I said, was key to the heart and soul of the Delta Mississippi. And then a lot of those artists who became discovered certainly went north and went up to Chicago. And Chicago became the locale for a lot of the more famous blues clubs and recording opportunities that blues artists had with major labels that would emerge. Whereas here in the Delta, in locations like Clarksdale, there were several juke joints in the single city of Clarksdale, even in the 30s. There are more now. And at a place that was the most famous juke joint within the city of Clarksdale was called the Dipsy Doodle. And the Dipsy Doodle had a Seaberg jukebox. And it was there that music would be played on the selected 45 or 78 record. I'm not sure which model the juke joint was or what it was able to play, probably 78s. But the idea here is that music, conversation, and kicking back and drinking, whether it was a soda or a beer, become the mainstay of the environment and culture. For this particular image I'm showing you, we also see that this became an untitled image by Post, largely because the two women are very much looking directly at the photographer. And so she didn't choose to use this image. Instead, she chose to use this one. And so there's a little bit more relaxed feel here, and certainly there's a more of a sense that the less of an awareness of the photographer's presence. The other thing that I also need to let you know, and I'll point this out a little bit more as we go along, was that before Marion Post Wolcott was able to enter into this juke joint, whichever one it was, Roy Stryker was adamant that if she was going to do it, she had to have a male escort to go with her. And once she solved that problem, there was a local white plantation owner's son who wanted to get a date with her. And she finally agreed to go out on a date with him if he accompanied her to the juke joint. And he's in one of the pictures, and I'll show that. The other thing, though, was that the townspeople of Clarksdale were equally uncomfortable with the idea of a white single woman going into the black environment of the juke joint. So they required that she have an officer accompany her and escort her. And he's in one of the pictures as well. So again, showing you the layers upon layers that were present in the 1930s. Now, later on in time, certain juke joints would provide a white only night for whites to go slumming like they used to do up in Harlem at the black clubs during the Prohibition era. But by and large, many juke joints were all black environments. Now, let me see here if I can make sure that I'm on track. So we've got a different focus here is an image and is of guys playing pool. This would show an example of a larger venue where a pool table could be present to provide entertainment for the guys. And again, you'll see that this is primarily a male setting, a male bonding with the guys, holding their pool cues. And in this one, we do see that there are a couple of guys that are very much aware of the presence of the photographer. However, she had enough of the attention with the central focus of the young men standing, that it was less distracting, I would imagine, from her, as opposed to the young man who is standing to the far right, who is rather fair-skinned. He is staring at her real suspiciously and kind of has a grimace on his face. She didn't let that dissuade her from the use of this image. This particular image, which seems a little less staged than the previous one, she labeled as untitled. And that's probably primarily because of the presence of the young man that she had to agree to let escort her. And the white man in the suit here is not part of the image that she wanted to have part of this juke joint environment experience. I'm going to go back just a little bit. I also want to have you pay attention and note that these young men are all rather well dressed. Notice the slacks that they're wearing, the pullover sweaters, the jackets, either the hats, the caps. They are all very well dressed. So we're not looking at a situation where the men are rather disheveled or have come here right after working in the field, so they're not wearing their work clothes. These are easily the clothes that they might even wear to church the following day, because all of these images are labeled as a Saturday, whether it's a Saturday afternoon, as the pool images were, and the gathering here at the table was also labeled as an afternoon gathering. And here, equally important, she's captured a moment that some might not necessarily agree with being captured, both in terms of the implications of gambling, but in this particular photograph, she is showing the young men counting their coins, counting their pay, and yes, at the far end of the table, some men are now playing cards, and some are the observers of the card game. And here we see it from another angle, but we see a little bit of paper currency, but some of the men are working with quarters. And then the other particular aspect of this image perhaps even shows that they might be now playing craps and playing with a pair of dice, rolling it, the numbers game, as it might be called in some quarters. This was also a very popular leisure time activity. And yes, in some circles, it was how the landowner got his payroll back, was through the losses that might be incurred. But for skilled men with the dice and or cards, they could possibly earn a little extra money. This photograph, though, particularly these two men on the end, are showing how well dressed. This is a nice, crisp jean jacket, and the jacket here, the zipper jacket that the man with the hat with the little older man with the little feather is showing, again, a sense that, you know, these are not disheveled, bedraggled, wearing whole, you know, clothes torn and ragged. These are men who are showing their best at the setting where they are enjoying the community of others. Whoops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead.
Yeah.
So here, we've got now the next set of images focuses on the images that better showcase women. Now, women would not necessarily be seen, or at least not photographed, as playing pool, shooting dice, or playing poker. Those might have been, even in terms of the gender norms of many within the Black community, just a barrier that good women didn't cross. But the field of dance was wide open. And in this particular image, we see the police officer that served as her second escort. Now, again, remember, she had to have two escorts, the local young lad and now an official police officer. And this is set and or officially labeled as still the afternoon. But we see two young folks, a couple that are already getting really engaged in doing the jitterbug. Some of you from the north may know this dance as the Lindy Hop. It was a very, very physical dance. It was a dance that involved lifting and jumping and almost acrobatic movements. It was extremely popular during the interwar years with big band performances and seeing the crowd of whites and blacks in different settings, for sure, but performing and dancing the Lindy Hop or the jitterbug. My grandmother, who grew up in Kentucky, when I was a little kid, she taught myself and some of my cousins how to do the jitterbug, and it was fun, it was physical, and boy was it exhausting. You had to have stamina to do it because of all the athleticism involved. So I am appreciative of some of the images that help capture that. You also can see that others who are gathering, they're watching, they're appreciative of the dance moves, the dance styles, and they are enjoying the command that the two dancers have over this dance. And so they are performing for their friends, but they also are enjoying the physicality of the dance themselves. So this is a great picture. This is one of the images that did get published and was known, but some people say that they read the white guy's face as a little bit bemused, but he's clearly the only person staring at the photographer in this image. Here are a couple of other examples that I want to show or share with you, in part to show the kind of celebratory nature, and with this, the angles that Marion Post Wolcott used in this set of images is showing a little bit more of the ceiling, and we're now getting, and these were all taken in November of 1939, and so we get a little bit more of the efforts on the part of the joint owner to provide decorative wreaths, or I forget what you call that kind of bunting, but it is suggestive that this might be around Thanksgiving time, so that we're seeing that this is a holiday season. And I am just flabbergasted when I look at this image and see how well dressed these women are. The clothes that they're wearing, the stockings, the purse, the gloves. These women are very, very well kept and are dressed to the nines, as my mom might say. But this is just, again, it's a way to appreciate the fact that there was a part of the Black community that had access to, and maybe they weren't, all what the image of the poor sharecropper, dirt farmer, that there was an upper working class, a middle class Black community that were able to have leisure money to come to a Juke Joint event like this. And these two women that we see to the right that are standing and kind of facing us are two women that were sitting at that table, probably more like the entranceway of the Juke Joint. And here they are in conversation with each other, despite the fact that the one woman who was very aware of Post at the table is still very aware of her presence. So she was very suspicious, and she does seem to be a little more guarded still about what is this white lady doing in our Juke Joint. Is she, what is she going to do with these images? Is there something we need to be suspicious of or afraid of? So I do think that the reality is that in a Jim Crow era, Blacks never felt fully safe around whites because whites could hurt them either economically or through a vicious tongue or mouth, and or certainly physically harm them. So I do think that it's important to continue to be reminded of that. And although I love these images that Marion Post Wolcott took, I do think that in some regards, despite her best efforts and best intentions, she was an outsider, an outlier, and an interloper, and yes, invading a little bit of this safe space. These images are showing again more of the dancing and the relaxing of the women, and I wanted you to see this image in particular because this young man is wearing brand new overalls. These jeans could probably stand up on their own. They're like fresh starched, and if it was in color, they'd be bright blue. And the woman in the very light coat in the center, I want you to stare down at her legs and notice that she's wearing very stylish nylons with that seam up the back. So she's very aware of the modern style of the day and what was considered to be a more sophisticated look in hosiery. Now let me go here. This is the last couple of images that I have, but we're seeing dancers engage more directly into what's going to become the Lindy Hop. This image is labeled as Evening, and it is one of the images that she titled for publication. The only thing I will admit is that I'm not sure who this white guy is with the glasses. I don't know if he's the owner operator. I don't know if what is happening. I will confess that I have been able to identify the other whites, but if anything, my guess would be is that he is the owner, proprietor of the Juke Joint at the time. So that's why I did want to include this and show that for all the dancing that's going around, that woman's body language doesn't seem to suggest that she's worried or concerned about his presence. So I think he is somebody who was regularly at the Juke Joint. Also notice that the dancing is happening on flat plywood boards. That's the, very unpainted. This again, very, simple design in the interior. More ad images will appear on the side walls. And it wasn't unusual for, at least in the Dipsy Doodle, for the Seaburg jukebox to be what was described as in the center of the room. So it's very possible that behind these dancers is the jukebox going. I couldn't find a picture that actually showed the jukebox.
Kim, I think that Barb Ross has a question.
Oh, okay.
And it's noon, just so you know. I mean, it's 1.
Oh, okay. Well, why didn't you give me any time breaks there, girl?
It was too interesting.
Okay. I'm just going to move to the next image, and then we can start having questions. This is probably the most widely reproduced image of the set, other than a couple of the color images. And this is just showing the jitterbug getting strutted out for the start, and that these guys are in center stage. And now I will close and take on any questions. Questions?
You'll need to unmute yourself because I've muted everybody.
Okay. Have you ever purchased any of these prints from the Library of Congress?
I haven't, but I have had friends do a couple of the Dorothea Lange prints, and what they got was, again, I think you get to specify the size that you would prefer, but you won't get, like, you can't get a blow up poster, but you would get what would be about an 8x10 formatted glossy print sheet that has the image on it, and then from there you could mount it and have it properly framed. Now, with the fact that everything's so digitized, you can download a digital image, and if you had quality photographic materials, you could go ahead and print the digital image yourself and hang it up. But I always think that there's a little bit more cachet to it if you get it printed by the Library of Congress. Yeah. But if you're interested in any of these images, I will send Roxanne another PowerPoint that includes all my notes. And what I did for that one is include the digital ID and the Library of Congress permanent link numbers on every image I showed, so that you could retrieve it very easily without having to do a lot of legwork, because the Library of Congress's website for this is not 100% user friendly. So I would, I'll be happy to share that with anybody.
Thanks, Kim. We'll be sure to post that.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Hey, my man.
What is LB? Thank you.
Where's Tyrone?
He's hanging around.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was really just, enlightening in a lot of ways, and I love the photos. They're great, and really appreciate you're doing this for us. Anybody else have questions?
So I was going to say, did I crowd out anybody being able to ask a question?
I had a question.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Barb, you had your hand up at some point. Did you have a question? Go ahead, Peggy. I guess not.
I have a question about the young woman's dress. She's in pants and she's got boots on. Would you guess she rode maybe a horse to the Juke Joint?
I definitely think that this gal was, she was being sporty, but she was also being daring. Remember that in the 1930s, women wearing pants was unacceptable. And that's where Marion Post Wolcott got reprimanded for wearing trousers. and that was what you called it. Remember Kate Hepburn? You know, she was the famous actress who even got reprimanded for wearing trousers in some of her films.
Yeah.
So yeah, I bet you this gal probably rode over, but because she's wearing jodhpurs,
Yeah,
as a
jodhpurs,
particular outfit, she's also showing that she comes from a family of more affluence because of the attire that she's wearing. She's got some darn nice boots and the jodhpur attire. So yeah, you're not seeing a lot of really downtrodden working dirt poor people in this juke joint setting.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So Kim, how many people do you think most of these places could fit?
Well, that goes. That's a little hard to guess. I have not found any kind of occupancy. Find or read was that sometimes it really was, you know, tightly pressed if it was a hot blues performer or something like that. But they talk about that people would then go outside the entranceway and would hang out on the porch or the walkway into the building. They could hear the music, and yet it wasn't necessarily a setting for dancing, but they could hear the music and keep drinking. And yeah, if there was a desperation, if I got to still play craps, you'd go to a flat surface on the side of the building and keep on with your crap game.
I was just thinking about that because it must have been fairly amazing, some of the performers they had in these really small venues. And I've always kind of liked seeing high quality performers in small venues.
Yeah, I would imagine from even looking at this photograph, and it looks pretty spacious at times. I would say easily, you know, close to 50 people were inside that building when she was taking those pictures.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, she can rip it.
Yeah.
No man, not just sitting on
I
the
have
ground.
No,
a
he's not. He's not.
question about how common photography was at this time. So would people be familiar with her having a camera around, or was this a very novel and rare experience?
The camera that she would have used inside this building would have been a little bit bigger, bulkier thing. And I also would imagine that she's using a flash with some of this. So it would have been, yeah, they would have been very aware. And remember that the slide negative is 3 1/4 by 4. So that, imagine the physicality of the size of that negative and a camera. So it would have to be a camera that, you know, is pretty boxy, even if you're holding it and it's got a flash handle above it. I don't know, Robert, do you know anything about the speed graphic of that time period, old cameras?
Peggy does.
I'll answer that. She probably used it because it would synchronize with the flash. It's what a photographer like Ernest Withers, who did all the photographs, he went to the clubs in Memphis, and it had to do with especially photographing dark skins and all, and especially outside, but inside too. And it had a different kind of a shutter than what we think of.
Say about speed graphics, but I guess she probably knows.
Yeah, speed graphic. And they're 2 1/4, so the negatives were 2 1/4 inches wide, generally by 3 1/2 high or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there were some that were big, had bigger negatives too. But yes, it had to do with the being able to handle the light, I think.
Yeah. But it would not have been normal for a woman, much less a white woman, you know, to go in and be carrying around these cameras. They were not innocuous like carrying around your cell phone. Everybody had one. And the kind of camera that was more commonplace was something called a brownie. And they were very smaller scale cameras. But in the Great Depression, if you were poor, that would have been one of the first things you'd try to hawk or sell. So again, leisure and affluence would be dictating who had the camera and their ability to kind of blend in. And so that auteur idea was, I think, a goal that she strived for, but it would have been very difficult in these environments that in particular.
Definitely. And that's why Leicas were the other camera that the FSA photographers used, and they were the smaller, but again, they had a leaf shutter instead of a focal plane shutter so that they could handle low light. But those were very expensive cameras. The Leicas were incredibly expensive. So
Yeah. Her personal camera of choice that she loved was the Rolleiflex 4x4. That was her. She owned one personally, and that she loved the documentary feel of it. But to the best of my knowledge, she was not allowed to officially use that for her government work.
Interesting.
Yeah, the farm securities.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation.
Oh, you're
Thanks, Kim,
most
and,
welcome. Thank you, everyone, for giving me an opportunity to share some of this. And yes, by virtue of having once lived in Greenville, Mississippi, the real Delta, I kind of learned a lot, and yet that was a real culture shock for me when I lived there in the early 80s. It was as if Jim Crow was still very much alive, and the ways in which whites and blacks interacted with each other. I rarely had a male black man look me directly in the eye. Even if we were talking, shop about blues or jazz music or whatnot, it was very, very rare. And I was able to go to a couple of blues clubs that were clearly all black environments, and they tolerated my presence, and I never had anybody bug me about being. But they met more at the VFW clubs, or there would be a couple of smaller nightclubs that were present, and it was a very different thing than this, other than just whites had a certain place that they wanted to go, or if whites wanted to hear real blues music at that time, they went to Memphis and went to the clubs in Memphis, and not coming to a little town like Greenville. And Greenville was, a big city. It was the biggest town 150 miles anywhere in a total circumference. And so a lot of people came there, to go to restaurants or do things, and those restaurants were rather hidden. So, but I appreciate you letting me talk, and I thank Roxanne for giving me the opportunity to share some of this, and I will get her that PowerPoint that's got the links on it, because I would encourage people, if you saw anything you liked, to get yourself your own.
We will post that on our website, and also this Zoom has been recorded, and we'll be posting that as well if you want to go back and look at, or if you have friends that missed out today, they can come and see it on our website.
Great.
So thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. And come see the photographic exhibit. That's the big thing.
Right.
Okay. Well, Roxanne, you're in charge of the camera and everything, and did everything go okay with?